There is a hole in the ground at Giza that the tour guides walk you straight past. It sits under a stone causeway a few hundred feet from the paws of the Sphinx, and for most of the last century, it was full of water. Local children used to swim in it. Nobody told them that 30 meters below where they were splashing, at the bottom of a shaft cut straight down through solid bedrock, there is a chamber. And in that chamber sits a black granite sarcophagus on an island, surrounded by water, ringed by 7 smaller rooms carved into the rock. It was never meant to be seen. It was sealed, it was flooded, and it was left off almost every map of Giza that tourists are ever handed. That chamber is real. You can look up the excavation reports, and when the archaeologist who finally pumped it dry reached the bottom, he found tunnels leading out of it. One heads north toward the Great Pyramid. One heads east toward the Sphinx. They are too narrow for a grown man to crawl through, and to this day, nobody has followed them to the end. That is not a legend. That is a documented site called the Osiris Shaft, and it is the thread we are going to pull on. Because once you know it exists, a much stranger question opens up underneath it. Not whether there is something beneath the pyramids. There demonstrably is. The question is how far it goes, who cut it, and why every serious attempt to map the full extent of it in the last 10 years has ended with a sealed gate. A shut-down expedition, or a government stepping in and calling the whole thing off. This is the story of the temple beneath the pyramids. The one hiding in plain sight, and the one that may be sitting 3,000 feet below it, that we are only now beginning to detect. By the end, you are going to understand exactly why no one was ever supposed to find it. Let me show you what is actually down there, because the reality is stranger than the myth. Start with the shaft itself. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 440 BCE, described an underground chamber beneath the Giza plateau. He said the priests told him it held the tomb of a king on an island surrounded by a channel of water fed from the Nile. For over 2,000 years, scholars treated this as a traveler's tall tale. Herodotus repeated a lot of things the Egyptian priests told him, and plenty of it was exaggeration or misunderstanding. An underground island tomb, surrounded by water, sounded like exactly that kind of embellishment. A story, a metaphor for the journey of the dead. Then, in the 1930s, an Egyptian archaeologist named Selim Hassan, working the causeway that links the Sphinx to the second pyramid, found the top of a shaft. He climbed down. The first level was a plain, empty room about 6 meters down. From that room, a second shaft dropped deeper. He got partway into it and hit water. The water table on the plateau was too high. Pumps in the 1930s could not clear it. He described what he could reach, noted that it continued down into the flood, and moved on. The bottom of it stayed underwater for another 60 years. It was Zahi Hawass, decades later in 1999, who finally drained it. By then, the plateau's water table had dropped enough that continuous pumping could hold the flood back long enough for a team to descend all the way. And what they found matched Herodotus, almost word for word. 3 levels. The lowest one, nearly 30 meters below the surface, opens into a wide hall. In the center of that hall is a raised stone platform, a rectangular island, around it, channels of water, and on the platform, a large granite sarcophagus. Around the edges of that hall, cut into the rock, are 7 burial chambers. Herodotus had not been exaggerating. He had been describing a real place. The priests had shown him, or told him about, a genuine underground structure. He simply had no way to convey what it actually was, so he called it what it looked like. A tomb on an island in the water, beneath the earth. Look at the layout again, because the details matter. The second level holds niches, side rooms cut into the rock, several of them containing sarcophagi. The third and lowest level is the hall with the water and the platform. Around that flooded island sit 7 burial chambers. 7. And the pottery recovered from that deepest level is the oldest datable material in the whole complex, which pushes the origin of the shaft back toward the Old Kingdom, the 6th dynasty, more than 4,000 years ago. That is the same broad era as the pyramids above it. This was not some later addition, some medieval curiosity dug into an old site. It belongs to the age of the builders themselves. And it is genuinely hard to explain how they made it. To sink that network of shafts and halls deep into the bedrock of Giza, below the water table, using the copper tools and stone hammers of the 6th dynasty, would be an astonishing feat. Even the archaeologists who accept the conventional timeline acknowledge the difficulty. You are cutting downward, in the dark, in flooding rock, to build a hall almost no living person would ever set foot in. Every practical instinct says you would not bother, and yet they did, with obvious care and obvious purpose. The question is not whether they could, it is why it mattered so much that they carved it anyway. Here is where it stops being a curiosity and starts being a problem. To cut that shaft, the ancient builders drove straight down through roughly 30 meters of limestone bedrock, then hollowed out a multi-room hall at the bottom, below the water table, in a plateau that floods. Doing that with the tools mainstream Egyptology credits to the period, copper chisels and stone pounders and rope, would be a staggering undertaking. Not impossible. Egyptians moved mountains of stone, but brutally difficult, done in the dark, in the wet, deep underground, for a chamber almost no one would ever enter. Nobody has a clean explanation for why. The official interpretation is that it was a symbolic tomb of the god Osiris, lord of the underworld, a ritual structure rather than a real burial. That may well be true, but it does not answer the harder question. And the harder question is the tunnels. Because the hall at the bottom is not the end. From the lowest chamber, small passages branch off. One runs north, its bearing points toward the Great Pyramid. Another runs east, toward the Sphinx. They are tiny, roughly 40 centimeters across, far too small for an adult. Hawas's team could not send anyone through them. In a detail that sounds like something out of a novel and is in the published record, a young boy was sent in to see how far they went. He got stuck. They had to pull him back out by his legs. And so the tunnels, beneath the tunnels, remain, to this day, unmapped. We know they exist. We know which direction they aim. We do not know where they end. And notice the aim of them. This is not random. A passage running north from the bottom of that shaft is running toward the Great Pyramid. A passage running east is running toward the Sphinx. Whoever cut them chose those bearings. You do not accidentally carve a 40-centimeter tunnel through solid bedrock in a straight line toward a specific monument. Someone wanted the House of Osiris connected to the things above it, and connected in a very deliberate geometry. We can measure the direction. We simply cannot follow the distance. There is also the uncomfortable engineering question that sits under all of this. Cutting narrow, precise passages horizontally through limestone bedrock, deep underground, in the dark, is exhausting and slow work with copper and stone. The precision of some of the underground cutting at Giza has fueled a long-running argument about what tools were really used, with some researchers insisting the tolerances look too clean for hand tools alone. Mainstream Egyptology answers, reasonably, that skilled crews with abundant time and copper can achieve remarkable results, and that we consistently underestimate ancient labor. That is probably true. But the debate exists for a reason, and it exists most sharply exactly here, in the deep, hidden, hard-to-reach cuts that almost no one was ever meant to see. Now hold that image. A sealed, flooded chamber, 30 meters down, with tiny passages aimed deliberately at the two most famous monuments on Earth, running off into rock that no one has ever followed. And ask yourself the obvious thing. If those passages connect to anything, what would it be? This is the point where most people assume we have hit the edge of what is known, and the rest is just speculation. It is not. In the last 8 years, Three separate teams, using three completely different technologies, have found empty space inside and beneath the Giza plateau that has no official explanation. And that is where this goes from a strange old shaft to something that has Egyptologists genuinely divided. Stay with me, because the deepest of those findings is the one they tried hardest to bury. Before we go down, one thing worth saying out loud. If you find the buried history of this planet as unsettling as I do, subscribe, because this channel exists to follow exactly these threads, the ones that get quietly closed off. Now, the first clue is the one you can see with your own eyes, and it is inside the Great Pyramid itself. For most of modern history, there was a firm belief about the Great Pyramid. Three chambers: the King's Chamber, the Queen's Chamber, and an unfinished subterranean chamber cut into the bedrock below. That was it. The rest was assumed to be solid stone. 19th century explorers had tunneled, blasted, and mapped their way through it, and the consensus was that the pyramid had given up all its secrets. For over 100 years, no major internal structure was found. The book was considered closed. Then a project called Scan Pyramids, launched in 2015, did something the 19th century explorers could not. Instead of digging, they used cosmic rays, muons, particles that rain down constantly from the upper atmosphere, pass through solid rock, but get absorbed at different rates depending on how much stone they travel through. Put sensitive detectors inside and around the pyramid. Count the muons arriving from every direction, and empty space shows up as a place where too many particles are getting through. It is a way to X-ray a mountain of stone without touching it. In November 2017, in the journal Nature, the team announced what they found. Above the Grand Gallery, the soaring passage that climbs toward the King's Chamber, there is a void, a large one, at least 30 meters long, with a cross-section similar to the Grand Gallery itself. To put that in human terms, it is roughly the length of the Grand Gallery all over again, a second great space stacked above the first, that nobody had ever entered or even suspected. It had sat there, sealed, hidden, for roughly 4,500 years. Three separate detector teams took part, from Japan, from France, using different technologies positioned at different points inside and outside the pyramid. All of them saw the same excess of muons pouring through the same region of stone. Not a glitch, not one instrument's error. Three independent methods. One enormous empty space in the heart of the most studied building in the ancient world. Think about what that means for everything anyone ever told you about the pyramid. The 19th century explorers who blasted their way in with gunpowder, the surveyors who measured every block, the century of Egyptologists who declared the structure fully understood. All of them missed a cavity the size of a cathedral nave sitting directly above the most famous passage in the building. If that could hide from all of them, in the part of the pyramid we can walk into, what are the odds the plateau below it gave up everything the moment we looked? The mainstream explanation is careful and reasonable. The scientists themselves refused to call it a chamber. They called it a void and suggested it might be a construction feature, a relieving space to take weight off the gallery below, or a gap left over from how the pyramid was built. That is a legitimate possibility. But here is the honest problem with it. We do not know. 4,500 years of study, the most examined structure on the planet, and in 2017 we discovered a 100-foot cavity inside it that nobody predicted and nobody can fully explain. If a space that large hid that long inside the pyramid, the question of what else is hiding is no longer paranoia. It is arithmetic, and they were not done. In March 2023, the same project confirmed a second void, this one just behind the north face, above the original entrance. A corridor, roughly 9 meters long, gabled with a peaked stone ceiling, sealed off from the outside. Muon imaging found it. Then ground-penetrating radar and ultrasound confirmed it. Again, nobody is certain what it is for. Again, the pyramid was hiding a room that a century of exploration had missed. That is the first clue. The pyramid is not solid, it is not fully mapped, and modern physics keeps finding empty rooms in it that the official history did not account for. But an empty space inside the pyramid is one thing. What sits beneath the whole plateau is another. That is the second clue, and it is the one that reaches straight back down to our shaft. Remember Herodotus. Remember the priests telling him about an underground world beneath Giza. The Egyptians had a name for the plateau, and the name is a clue in itself. They called it, in the hieroglyphs, the House of Osiris, Lord of Rostau. And Rostau was not vague poetry. Rostau referred specifically to underground passages, tunnels, a network of them, threading beneath the surface, belonging to the god of the dead. For a long time, this was read the way you would read any mythology, as religious symbolism about the afterlife. The land of the dead is beneath us. Every culture says something like it. But when Hawass reached the bottom of the Osiris Shaft, he found something carved into the floor of that lowest chamber, a hieroglyphic sign, the sign for Per, meaning house, the House of Osiris. The exact phrase the whole plateau was named for, cut into the stone at the bottom of a hidden flooded shaft, with tunnels running off toward the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. The name of the plateau was not describing a myth. It was describing infrastructure. A house beneath the ground connected by tunnels. Rostau. And the builders left the label at the bottom of the shaft 30 meters down, where they never expected anyone to read it. So, the ancient Egyptians told us, in their own writing, that Giza sits on top of a system of underground passages. They named the entire plateau after it. We found one entrance to that system, the Osiris Shaft, and it has tunnels heading off in exactly the directions the myth implies, toward the monuments above. The mainstream reading is that these are symbolic and ritual, a spiritual geography rather than a physical one. And maybe. But we have physical tunnels, cut in physical rock, that we have never followed to the end. The symbolism and the stone say the same thing, and only one of them can be dug. And there is a second ancient witness worth pulling in here, because Herodotus was not the only classical writer describing something enormous and underground in Egypt. He and later writers described a structure they called the labyrinth, a building with thousands of rooms, half of them above ground and half of them below. The lower half sealed and forbidden to visitors, said to contain the tombs of kings. The ancient world was consistent on this point across centuries. Egypt had underground works on a scale that later readers found almost impossible to believe. For a long time, the labyrinth was treated as another exaggeration. Then archaeologists found the surface remains of a massive structure that fit the description, and the underground half remains, to this day, largely unexcavated. The pattern repeats. The ancients described something vast beneath the ground. Modern scholars call it myth. And then, piece by piece, the ground gives up evidence that they were describing something real. Now, overlay that onto Giza, a plateau named for its underground passages. A shaft that proves at least one of those passages is real. Tunnels aiming at the two great monuments, and an entire classical tradition insisting that beneath Egypt's surface lies a second Egypt, sealed and forbidden. The people who built these things did not think of the pyramids as the whole story. They thought of the surface as the lid. Which brings us to the third clue, the one that broke the internet in 2025, the one real scientists are fighting over right now. And the one I want you to be genuinely careful with, because this is where the story is strongest and weakest at the same time. In March 2025, a team led by two researchers, Corrado Malenga of the University of Pisa in Italy and Filippo Biondi of the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, held a press conference and made an extraordinary claim. Using a technique they call synthetic aperture radar tomography, radar data gathered from satellites and processed to read vibrations deep underground. They said they had imaged structures beneath the Khafre pyramid, not small ones. They described 5 identical multi-level structures near the base of the pyramid. linked by geometric pathways. They described 8 enormous vertical shafts descending, by their reading, more than 600 meters straight down, wrapped in what looked like spiral pathways. And they described a network below all of that, extending, they claimed, as much as 2 kilometers beneath the plateau. Vertical wells, spiral staircases, channels that resembled pipework, like a buried plumbing system. And beneath it all, a scale of construction that would make the pyramids themselves look like the visible tip of something vastly larger. If that is real, it is the most important archaeological discovery in human history. It would mean the pyramids are a doorway, not a destination. It would line up uncomfortably well with everything we have just walked through. Herodotus and the underground water chamber. Rostau, the named network of tunnels. The Osiris Shaft with its passages aimed at the monuments. The muon voids proving the plateau still hides enormous empty spaces. Suddenly, a 2-kilometer subterranean complex beneath Khafre is not a wild leap. It is the thing all the other clues have been pointing at. Here is where it gets strange and where the resistance comes in. The reaction from institutional archaeology was immediate and hard. Zahi Hawass himself, the man who drained the Osiris Shaft, dismissed the 2025 radar claims flatly, saying the technique is not scientifically validated for imaging at that depth. The findings were released through a press conference and a preprint rather than fully accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. Mainstream scientists pointed out that radar does not straightforwardly penetrate kilometers of solid rock, that these structures could be artifacts of how the data was processed, that an AI was used to interpret the signal, and AIs can conjure patterns out of noise. The word unproven got attached to it fast and stayed. And they may be right. I am going to be straight with you, because I would rather you trust me than sell you a fantasy. Now, does this prove there is a hidden city 2 kilometers under the pyramids? No, it does not. The 2025 radar claims are contested, they have not cleared full peer review, and the specific images of spiral shafts and underground cities should be treated with real caution. If someone tells you it is confirmed, they are ahead of the evidence. It is worth understanding why the claim caught fire so fast, because the ground was already prepared for it. For decades, there has been a fringe theory, most famously argued in a 1998 book by Christopher Dunn called The Giza Power Plant, that the Great Pyramid was never a tomb at all, but a machine, a structure that generated or channeled energy, with the underground chambers as part of its workings. When the 2025 team described vertical shafts and pipe-like channels descending hundreds of meters, that community heard confirmation of everything they had argued. The team themselves went further, suggesting that the legendary Hall of Records, a fabled, sealed library of lost knowledge that psychics and treasure hunters have chased under Giza for a century, might lie somewhere in their imaged complex. That is the moment a contested radar reading turns into a viral sensation. It stopped being an archaeology story and became a story about hidden knowledge, and the internet ran with it before the peer review could even begin. I am not going to sell you the power plant or the Hall of Records. There is no solid evidence for either, and the researchers making the deepest claims are the ones with the least independent confirmation. But here is what that skepticism does not erase, and this is the part that matters. Strip away the contested 2025 radar entirely. Throw it out completely. You are still left with a documented, excavated, physically real chamber 30 meters beneath the plateau, sealed and flooded for centuries, with tunnels running off toward the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx that no one has ever followed to the end. You are still left with 2 enormous voids inside the Great Pyramid, confirmed by cosmic ray physics and radar, that 100 years of exploration missed. You are still left with an ancient civilization that named the entire plateau after a network of underground passages, and then carved the word house into the floor of the deepest chamber we have reached. None of that is fringe. None of that is contested. All of it is in the peer-reviewed and excavation record. And all of it says the same thing the radar team was reaching for, just more quietly. There is more beneath Giza than anyone has mapped, and we keep finding it by accident. So the grounded version of this story is not a letdown. It is arguably more disturbing. It is this. The pyramids sit on top of a partially artificial underground landscape that the builders themselves documented, that modern instruments keep confirming in pieces, and that has never been fully explored, because the tunnels are too small. The chambers flood, and the one time a team announced they had imaged the whole thing, the discovery was disputed and shut down within weeks. Which is the pattern worth noticing. Every time someone gets close to the full picture, the door closes. Salim Hassan hit water and had to stop. Hawass reached the bottom and found tunnels too tight to enter, then sent a boy who got stuck. The 2025 team announced a subterranean complex and were dismissed. Their site never opened for the independent excavation that would settle it. It was known, it was named, it was mapped in pieces, and then, every single time, it slipped back out of reach. If the deepest version of this is ever confirmed, and I want to be clear that it has not been, the implications are hard to overstate. It would mean the pyramids were never the point. It would mean the monuments we have been staring at for 4,500 years are the roof of something. A marker on the surface, above a structure built downward into the earth, on a scale, and to a purpose we have no framework for. It would mean an entire chapter of human history, the part underground, was written before the visible one and then deliberately sealed off. And it would mean the Egyptians told us, in the name they gave the plateau, exactly what was there, and we spent 2,000 years reading it as poetry. We may never get to find out. The permits to fully excavate the Osiris Shaft tunnels have never been granted. The 2025 radar findings sit in dispute, with no independent dig approved to confirm or kill them. The Egyptian authorities have every reason to move slowly and little reason to move at all, and so it stays where it has always been. The shaft is still there, 30 meters down, under a causeway most visitors never walk. The black sarcophagus still sits on its island in the water, ringed by 7 empty chambers, with 2 tunnels running off into the dark toward the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. No one has followed them to the end. No one has been allowed to. The plateau still keeps the name the Egyptians gave it, the House of Osiris, Lord of the Underground Passages. And somewhere beneath the most photographed structures on the planet, in rock that has swallowed every attempt to map it, those passages are still waiting for someone to reach the room at the end. If this pulled you in, the next investigation on screen right now goes even deeper into what the ancient record was quietly trying to tell us. Watch it now.